In the last video, we examined the James-Lange theory, which held that emotions are feelings of bodily processes. Today, we're going to look at cognitive theories. So there are many different versions of the cognitive theory of emotion, but the unifying claim is that emotions necessarily involve thoughts or cognitions. Because cognitive theories emphasize thoughts, they are able to solve the problems that faced the James-Lange theory. So let's just go through those. So regarding Walter Cannon's objection that emotions can have the same bodily profile, well, that's no problem for the cognitive theory because it's the thought that counts, and emotions that have the same bodily profile can involve different thoughts. The objection from anthropology that different cultures have different emotions, well, that's entirely to be expected given the very different worldviews, the different conceptual schemes that we find in other cultures. The example of the emotion from the Middle Ages that was connected with religious duty makes perfect sense on the cognitive theory, because back in the Middle Ages, religion was a central part of people's lives. They're going to be thinking about it a lot. Those thoughts can form the basis of emotions. Third, there was the problem that some emotions seem to be associated with too many bodily states. For instance, romantic love can be expressed as joy, fear, grief, guilt, anger. Even if we can show that joy has a unique bodily profile, it's unlikely we'll be able to show that romantic love does. But on the cognitive theory, what defines romantic love are the thoughts. Romantic love isn't a matter of having a certain heart rate and blood pressure and oxygen content of the blood. It involves a mental attachment to someone. You think you have a thought along the lines of, I can't live without this person. Finally, the problem that emotions have the features of intentionality and rationality that brute bodily states don't seem to share. Well, intentionality and rationality are perhaps the defining features of thoughts. If being angry involves making a judgment along the lines of, I have been wronged, it makes sense how that can be rational or irrational. You might not have a good reason to believe that you've been wronged, in which case you should stop being angry. So those were the sort of problems that we saw for the James-Lange theory, and as you can see on cognitive theories, these just aren't issues at all. So that should give you some idea of why cognitive theories have been so appealing. Now, there are, as I say, various different cognitive theories on the market. The simplest is the pure cognitive theory, according to which emotions are simply thoughts. There's nothing more to an emotion than that. For instance, fear might be the belief that one is in danger plus the desire to avoid danger. Anger towards somebody might be the belief that that person has wronged me. This kind of pure cognitive theory has been defended by Robert Solomon in his earlier work, at least, and Martha Nussbaum, for instance. And so these theories totally downplay the importance of bodily processes. Of course, this isn't to say that bodily processes and feelings don't correlate with emotions. Obviously they do, but you don't actually need them to experience an emotion. Thoughts alone are sufficient. Nussbaum actually offers an inversion of James's subtraction argument. She says, suppose a close relative has died and you're grieving. You're feeling terribly sad. We then do some tests and find out that your pulse is steady, you're not sweating, there's no nausea, and so on. This isn't of the slightest relevance to your sadness. Okay, your sadness is constituted by your judgments, that the bodily states are completely tangential. So Nussbaum thinks you can imagine experiencing an intense emotion without any bodily states. I must say that I find that to be totally unconvincing. Maybe Martha Nussbaum is just differently constituted to me, but I can't imagine experiencing serious grief without any bodily response. I think maybe what might be going on there is that you can judge that you sort of should be feeling grief. So very often people find that after a bereavement they don't immediately have a strong reaction about it, and that can be disturbing. You can make a judgment like, this is the kind of situation that should elicit grief, without feeling grief. So it seems to me that might be what's going on really in Nussbaum's example of somebody who seems to be feeling something, but actually doesn't have any bodily response. I can't imagine an intense emotion without the bodily element of it to it. So I mean, in general, the obvious problem with this kind of pure cognitive theory is that there just clearly seems to be more to emotions than cognitions. Emotions seem to really involve feelings. They also sort of seem to have this valence. They can be good or bad, pleasurable or displeasurable. Of course, defenders of pure cognitive theories do have ways around this. We can emphasise that many thoughts are evaluative. So I can have the thought that something is good or that something is bad. And maybe this captures the sort of valence of emotion. Still, I mean, there does seem to be something rather spare and cold about the pure cognitive theory. Maybe a more plausible cognitive theory is the SchachterSinger Theory. So in the last video, we discussed the study by Schachter and Singer. Recall that the results of that study were that those who were informed of the effect of the drug exhibited no emotional response. Those who were uninformed exhibited anger in the anger condition and positive emotion in the euphoria condition. So this suggests what's become known as the two-factor theory or cognitive labelling theory. Emotions are bodily states plus a cognitive interpretation or a label of those states. Suppose you see a snake. Seeing the snake produces a generic bodily arousal, right? It's just an adrenaline rush or whatever. The same sort of arousal that would happen if you were angry or maybe that would happen if you were extremely joyous. Okay, it's just a generic state of arousal. Because of the circumstances, because the arousal was caused by a threatening situation, you interpret that arousal as fear. Fear is the bodily response plus the label of the bodily response. In different circumstances, you might label the response differently. So if your heart had started to race because somebody has assaulted you, you'd interpret it as anger. If you know that somebody has injected you with adrenaline, you'll not label it at all. It'll be seen as a brute reaction to the drug, so no emotion will occur. Undergoing an emotion involves figuring out the reason why we're undergoing certain bodily changes. So sometimes we'll interpret those changes as fear or interpret them as anger. Sometimes we'll just say, well, we've been injected with a drug and that causes rapid heart rate, so we won't look for an emotion. So an important point to note here is that the bodily response need not have been caused by the stimulus that you associate with the emotion. In Schachter and Singer's study, remember, participants who were uninformed of the side effects of the injection felt angry, but they felt angry towards the questionnaire, but the questionnaire didn't cause their physiological arousal. The arousal was a result of being injected with adrenaline. They experienced anger because they were undergoing this generic physiological arousal, and they quite naturally attributed this arousal to what was going on around them, specifically this questionnaire with insulting questions on it. So if we diagram the Schachter-Singer theory, we have a stimulus plus a certain kind of bodily response. The stimulus may or may not have caused the bodily response, but we think about the stimulus, and that causes us to label our response as one emotion or another. Being in the presence of a threatening snake leads me to label my bodily response as fear, even if the state has actually been caused by something else. So the emotion is then the bodily state plus the label, and I think that's relatively straightforward. Okay, a popular form of cognitive theory are appraisal theories, first proposed by Magda Arnold, although we'll examine the somewhat more sophisticated version from Richard Lazarus. So Schachter and Singer's theory is that we have a bodily response and then we make a cognitive interpretation of that response, and that's the emotion. Appraisal theories are sort of in a sense the other way around. On this theory, cognitive judgments cause the bodily states. In particular, a certain kind of cognitive judgment known as appraisals cause the bodily states. Emotions are states, maybe bodily states or patterns of behaviour or brain states or whatever, that are caused by appraisals. We have a thought, an appraisal, and the appraisal leads to the emotional state. The appraisal is crucial. the same bodily state can be a different emotional state if they've been caused by different appraisals. And different bodily states can be the same emotional state if they've been caused by the same appraisals. So consider a sunburn, right? There are various other things that might cause the same physical damage, but a burn only counts as a sunburn if it's been caused by exposure to the sun. So the crucial point here is the appraisal. We might diagram it like this, although don't take this diagram too literally, since on some appraisal theories the bodily arousal isn't actually part of the emotion. Similarly, on some appraisal theories, the appraisals aren't part of the emotion, they're just necessary causes of the emotion. So this diagram might be a bit misleading, but the crucial claim is that appraisal judgments are necessary for emotions. Okay, these appraisal judgments here, and appraisal judgments are what cause our bodily responses. So, I've said that according to appraisal theory, emotions are caused by appraisals. An appraisal involves judging that something affects you in a way that matters to you. It's a judgment about how the relationship between you and your environment will affect your well-being. This will be a bit clearer once we spell out the theory, so let's look at one of Lazarus's proposals. Lazarus distinguishes what he calls primary appraisals and secondary appraisals. Primary appraisals are interpretations of the situation, and there are three primary appraisals. First, goal relevance, where we ask ourselves, is this situation relevant to my goals? If not, we won't feel any emotion towards it. Obviously, goals are interpreted here quite broadly. Things happening on a different continent might not have any relevance to your goals in terms of what you want to do with your life, but you can desire that other people have good lives, and so when you see poverty on different continents, that can frustrate your goals in a sort of broader sense. Second, goal congruence, where we ask ourselves, will this facilitate or thwart my goals? And of course this determines whether the ensuing emotion is positive or negative. If the situation will facilitate my goals, it's going to be a good emotion. If the situation will frustrate them, it's going to be a negative emotion. Third type of ego involvement, where we specify what kinds of goals are at stake. What's at stake? It might be identity or self-esteem or moral values or the well-being of others or our life goals or whatever. The secondary appraisals are an assessment of resources available for dealing with the situation. So there's blame or credit, where we ask who or what is responsible for the situation. We assign responsibility. Next, there's coping potential. We ask, how will we be able to deal with the situation and its consequences? So this includes both problem solving and also the kind of psychological impact of whether we'll be able to adjust if the situation doesn't become better. Finally, future expectancy, which is an evaluation of whether things will become more or less in line with our goals in the future. So let's consider anger. A situation that provokes anger will be appraised as relevant to one's goals, incongruent with one's goals. It could impact self-esteem, social standing, moral values, well-being of others. Obviously, there are many circumstances that can provoke anger. For secondary appraisals, we will judge that it's appropriate to assign blame. Anger requires blaming somebody, and obviously that determines who the anger is directed towards. We may judge that some sort of attack or aggression is viable, and that goal congruence is likely to be facilitated by attack. So when we make these kinds of appraisals, that will lead to anger. There are two important things to bear in mind here. First of all, not all these appraisals may be necessary in order for the emotion to be generated. So with anger, perhaps only the first four are actually required. We need not judge that attack is viable in order to feel anger, although that will probably encourage the anger. Similarly, love may require only the three primary appraisals. So love is goal relevant, goal congruent, and the ego involvement is desire for mutual appreciation and affection. Things like blame, credit, and coping potential, and so on, may not be necessary to have the emotion of love. So just bear in mind that this isn't sort of fixed. You don't necessarily need all of these appraisal dimensions. A second thing to bear in mind is that appraisals are not usually conscious judgments. So in general, we seem to make quite a lot of unconscious cognitive appraisals of situations, right? If you look up cognitive biases, many of these involve unconscious judgments. For instance, the halo effect. If you take 100 university professors, give them all the same essay to mark, on half of them attach a picture of a very attractive person, on the other half attach a picture of an ugly person, the essay supposedly written by the attractive person will, on average, get a much higher mark. It's not fair, but that's the way it works. Now, nobody's consciously thinking to themselves, oh, I'm going to give higher marks to sexy people. It's just that when we judge that somebody is attractive, this creates an unconscious bias in their favour in many people. Not much we can do about it. This just seems to be how our minds work. Similarly, consider racism. There was a study, I believe, that sent out job application forms. The forms were exactly the same, except some had stereotypically white names, the others had stereotypically black names. The ones with the black names were rejected far more often. Now again, it's probably not that people are consciously racist. I mean, there are such people, but in general the problem is that even the most enlightened individuals have these unconscious biases. So, in general then, psychologists will appeal to unconscious judgments. And most defenders of appraisal theory would say that the appraisals that are involved in emotion are unconscious. We don't consciously think about them. When we get angry with somebody, we're not usually thinking to ourselves, well, how is this relevant to my goals? Is it congruent? What type of ego involvement is there? Obviously that doesn't happen. This is a description of processes that are going on unconsciously. Now, treating appraisals as unconscious allows us to deal with three fairly obvious objections. So one objection is this sort of phenomenological objection that emotions are often immediate. Somebody insults us, we immediately feel angry. But if appraisals are subconscious processes, then you shouldn't expect to be aware of them, right? So experientially, it will seem as if the emotion is an immediate response to the event, even though there's actually this quite complex appraisal behind it. Second objection is that there are many cases where the appraisals seem to be false, where we know that the appraisals are false. For instance, if my computer stops working, I might get angry at my computer. But it doesn't make sense to blame my computer. A computer is an inanimate object. So again, since the appraisal is subconscious, you can appraise things as blameworthy even if you rationally know that it doesn't make much sense to do that. Third, this treating appraisals as subconscious allows the appraisal theorist to answer James's subtraction argument. Recall James's argument that bodily states are necessary for emotion because you can't, if you took away the bodily states, there wouldn't be any emotion there. There would just be nothing. It would just be a cold intellectual state. Well, what we can say here is it might be that the bodily states are all you actually experience in an emotion. Appraisals are a necessary component. They're indeed the central component, but they happen without your awareness. So that explains why the body seems to have this central role, because the really important thing, the appraisals, are going on unconsciously. Now, when we combine and summarise all the appraisals involved in generating an emotion, we get what Lazarus calls the core relational theme of the emotion. The core relational theme summarises what the appraisals tell us about our relationship to the environment. So summarising the appraisals involved in generating anger, we get a demeaning offence against me and mine. That corresponds pretty well to the sorts of situations that we would intuitively expect to provoke anger. Here's a table of a few other core relational themes. Guilt is you evaluate yourself as having transgressed a moral imperative. Compassion, you're being moved by another's suffering and wanting to help, and so on. I mean, that's fairly fairly straightforward stuff there. Okay, a number of influential objections to cognitive theories were given in the article On the Primacy of Effect by Robert Zajonc. Robert Zajonc. I believe that name is pronounced Zajonc, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But that's how the Wikipedia pronunciation guide has his name. It's one I don't know. I don't know where he's from, but I can't remember. But it's one of those foreign countries where they have strange uses of letters. So Robert Zajonc, I believe. First of all, Zajonc appeals to the phylogenetic and ontogenetic primacy of emotions. So phylogeny concerns evolutionary relationships between species, and ontogeny is the development of an organism over its own life. So the argument here is that emotions emerge earlier in evolutionary history and earlier in the organism's development than cognitions do. For instance, many non-human animal species and also human infants appear to be capable of experiencing fear and sadness and so on. But it seems a stretch to suppose that they can make complex judgments about their relations to the environment that the appraisal theory suggests. Can a dog ask itself whether or not a situation is relevant to its goals? Can it sort of say, okay, what's at stake here, my social standing or my moral values? It seems unlikely. So Lazarus responds to this that cognitions may not be limited to developed humans. A dog can make cognitive appraisals. Remember, first of all, that appraisals are subconscious processes, right? They don't necessarily involve holding propositional beliefs. Now, dogs can certainly represent the world as being a certain way. They can represent their place in the world, and that's all that's required for making appraisals. Obviously, a dog won't be able to make the complex appraisals that humans can, but similarly, they have severely restricted emotional repertoire. A dog never felt romantic jealousy, for instance. But there's no reason to deny that a dog can make the kinds of appraisals involved in fear or surprise. Dogs do seem to be able to understand when a situation poses a threat to their well-being. So Lazarus says, look, actually, there's no reason to think that emotions are prior to cognitions. Okay, there are very simple forms of cognitions, and actually, dogs and infants can make cognitions. But I suppose the second point here is that if we do insist on denying that dogs can make cognitive appraisals, why not deny that a dog can feel emotions, right? I mean, the only reason we have for attributing emotions to dogs is that their brains are structurally similar to ours and they display similar behaviour to us. Okay, that's why we think dogs exhibit emotions. It's because of how they behave, and it's because of the fact that we know they have a sort of similarly structured brain. But exactly the same points support attributing certain limited cognitive skills to dogs. So if we're going to deny that dogs can sort of have simple cognitions, it seems we could also just deny that they experience emotions. Okay, a second Zajonc appeals to neuroanatomical evidence. Actually, much of the work that Zajonc cites here has been superseded, I think, but more recent neuroscientific findings may support the same point. So Jesse Prinz points out that many emotions bypass the higher cognitive areas of the brain when we look at the kind of neural processing of emotion. It bypasses the cognitive areas. So let's say you look at something, you see a snake. The information on the retinal image is sent down the optic nerve into the thalamus. The thalamus is unable to recognize objects. It sends sensory information to the neocortex. Now, the neocortex is the more sophisticated sort of rational. That's where the rational and cognitive processing occurs. So the thalamus sends information to the neocortex. It also sends information to the amygdala. The amygdala are two almond-shaped structures very deep in the temporal lobes. Now, the amygdala is directly connected to various parts of the brain, such as the hypothalamus and the periaqueductal grey matter, that control bodily responses. These parts control the responses like heart rate, breathing, facial expression, hormone levels, the fight, flight or freeze mechanism, and so on. Now, crucially, the amygdala can sort of initiate these bodily changes without any input from the neocortex. Okay, so the thalamus receives information of a threatening stimulus, like the snake. That information is sent to the amygdala, and that then sort of sends information down to the thalamus, to the grey matter, and that immediately produces a bodily response, presumably an expression of fear. And it does that without engaging the areas of the brain that are involved in kind of cognitive and rational processing. I mean, we certainly know that the amygdala has a central role in emotion. Destruction of the amygdala tends to severely diminish both aggressive and fearful responses. That's been seen with humans who've had diseases that have damaged the amygdala, and also in animals that have had their amygdala removed. So it seems that that some emotional processing occurs without engaging the cognitive areas of the brain. Other lines of evidence are also suggestive. Antonio Damasio and other researchers in the article Subcortical and Cortical Brain Activity During the Feeling of Self-Generated Emotion, they found that during emotion the somatosensory cortices and the upper brainstem nuclei are activated, and those are involved in detecting bodily states. So those are the areas that tend to be active during emotion, but they're also involved in detecting bodily states, which would tend to suggest something more like the james-lange theory, that emotions are feelings of bodily states. So arguably, some of the recent neuroscience poses problems for cognitive theories. Of course, this stuff is very controversial. Neuroscience is still a young science, so it's not clear that this really proves cognitive theories wrong or anything like that. There's still a lot of debate here. Okay, third, Zajonc points out that cognitive judgments can change without the corresponding emotion changing. If I'm angry with somebody, I can accept their apology or believe their side of the story, but still feel angry with them. So for instance, let's say you think you discover your partner cheating. You notice that she's started to act very secretive and suspicious. One day you follow her and you see her meeting up in a cafe with some other man, and she seems a bit too close with him. Now, in fact, she wasn't cheating at all. She was being secretive because she was planning a surprise party for you, and the man in the cafe was just her brother. Now she convinces you that your concerns are misplaced, and yet the feeling of sort of jealousy and anger can still remain. Consider also phobias. I may be well aware that flying is perfectly safe, but still be extremely afraid of flying. So here we have an emotion in spite of our cognitive judgments. The cognitive judgment says, look, this is perfectly fine, it's perfectly safe, but the emotion is one of intense fear. So I suppose the obvious response to these cases is that this is a case of contradictory beliefs. Rationally, you know that flying is perfectly safe, but you have some deeper belief, a deeper appraisal that flying is dangerous. Maybe a good comparison would be optical illusions. This is the Muller-Lyer illusion. These lines are actually the same length. The straight lines here are the same length, even though they appear different. Here's the checker shadow illusion, one of my favourite illusions. The grey squares marked A and B are actually exactly the same colour, which is remarkable, but just take a screenshot of it and look at it in MS Paint or something if you don't believe me. I actually showed this to my dad once, and he refused to believe that they were the same colour. I even went on Paint and moved one of the boxes down to prove it, but he said I was just manipulating it. I couldn't convince him that they were the same colour. Anyway, the point is this. I know that the two lines are the same length, and that these two squares are the same colour, but I can't help seeing them as being different. Perceptions involve judgments. Perceptions represent the world as being a certain way, and these judgments, these representations, can conflict with your more considered beliefs. I remember that appraisals are subconscious judgments, right? They probably involve very different systems of the brain than your more rational judgments. Just like in visual perception, the part of the brain involved in presenting these as different shades of grey is different from the part of the brain that kind of deals with the higher cognitive activity, the part of the brain that sort of judges that these are actually the same colour, right? That there are different systems involved in that. Perhaps a similar problem along the same lines as the last one is that we often make judgments without feeling the corresponding emotion. I can judge that a person has wronged me without feeling angry. I can judge that I'm in great danger without feeling afraid. Some people are remarkably stoic. So, in response, first of all, note that in such cases we might not be making all the appropriate appraisals. Okay, there are many appraisals that are required for an emotion. Merely thinking I'm in great danger won't lead to fear. You might think that you're in great danger, but you're also suicidal, so you don't care about your own well-being. Or you might believe that you're well equipped to handle the danger, so it doesn't faze you. Or maybe you've spent a lifetime training as a Zen monk and you've learned to suspend all value judgments and just accept whatever comes to pass. The point is that in order to be afraid, you have to make a variety of different appraisals. Still, I mean, with that said, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that somebody could make all the right appraisals and still not experience fear. So somebody could think, for instance, I'm in great danger. I don't know how to deal with this danger. I don't want to be harmed, and so on, and still not actually have the fear. That seems plausible to me. So a second response to this is that many cognitive theories allow that the body has an important role. So we might hold that emotions require appraisals followed by certain bodily states. And remember that the SchachterSinger Theory held that emotions are bodily states plus cognitive interpretations of those states. So the bodily states are still important. The cognitive theory says that cognitions are necessary for emotion. So if you have an emotion, there's got to be a cognition there. Right? The cognition is necessary for it. But not all cognitive theories claim that cognitions are sufficient for emotion. So it's no surprise that you can sometimes make the right appraisals without experiencing the corresponding emotion. Fifth, Zajonc notes that emotions can be induced by alterations of the body. Consider the effects of drugs on emotions, such as how alcohol can induce greater confidence. Similarly, consider certain medical conditions. Hyperglycemia is low blood sugar, and this tends to cause anxiety. If anxiety is just, say, a perception of a bodily state, as the james-lange theory suggests, well, that makes sense, since hyperglycemia causes the bodily changes associated with anxiety, like rapid heart rate and pale skin. But it's less obvious what hyperglycemia has to do with cognitive appraisals. More strikingly, simply making facial expressions can induce emotions. In one study, researchers had one group hold a pen in their mouths in such a way that it made the muscles adopt a kind of smiling position. They were smiling, but they didn't know they were smiling. And this group had an improved mood. The other group held the pen in a way that made a grimace. This group had a more depressed mood. I mean, this is particularly problematic with cognitive theories because the expressions were completely unintended and unknown on the part of the participants. In another study by Zajonc himself and some colleagues called Feeling and Facial Efference, participants were asked to evaluate how they felt about various stories. These stories had very little difference in content. The difference was that some stories emphasised vowel sounds that caused facial expressions that happened to be associated with negative emotions. Others emphasised vowel sounds causing expressions associated with positive emotions. For instance, the name Jürgen makes the facial muscles adopt a state associated with sadness, whereas the name Peter brings the muscles into more of a kind of smile. 81% of the participants said that the Jürgen stories were less pleasant. So, minor differences in the facial muscles appears to affect emotional response. It's not really clear why that would be on the appraisal theory, on cognitive theories in general. This seems to be a case of emotions being induced without thoughts. One response to this problem from Gerald Claw is that in such cases people aren't actually experiencing real emotions, they're merely experiencing as-if emotions or quasi-emotions. The affective states that are produced by facial expressions aren't real emotions. They feel very much like emotions, but they're not. Recall the analogy to sunburn, right? Something that wasn't caused by an exposure to the sun can't be a sunburn, no matter how much like a sunburn it may be. Similarly, the appraisal theorist need not deny that we often experience states like emotions without appraisals, but they shouldn't be classed as emotions. They're just states like emotions. Maybe what we could say instead is that these are moods. Moods are perhaps less intense than emotions, and they don't have any intentionality, unlike emotions. They're not about anything. When you smile, this produces a pleasant mental state in you. It puts you in a good mood, but that's not a state of happiness. Happiness is the emotional state. Happiness is intentional and rational and so on, whereas when you smile, that's just a kind of positive mood. I find this kind of unconvincing. For one thing, it just seems rather ad hoc to me. The natural way of describing the cases that Zajonc discusses is that they produce emotions. Note that in saying that they're not really emotions, it is difficult to specify what exactly they are instead. So maybe they're moods, but moods are often considered to be kinds of emotion, or at least they're very closely associated with emotions, so that the line between them is extremely difficult to draw. A second problem with this response is that processes like facial feedback are central to the development of our emotional and social capacities. As infants, we mimic the expressions of others from the moment of birth, and that interaction is absolutely central to emotional learning. So the point is that we seem to have kind of independent reasons for thinking that facial expression is important to emotions, which makes it doubly implausible to say that the feelings caused by facial expressions aren't real emotions. Maybe a more plausible response is to say that alterations of the body also affect one's appraisals. And this is quite easy to see with examples like drugs and medical conditions like hypoglycemia. For one thing, these things directly affect the brain and the cognitive functioning. One of the main reasons people take drugs is because of the way they alter cognitive processing. So it's no surprise that if emotions are constituted by cognitive appraisals, then drugs could have immediate emotional effects. And also bear in mind that if you take drugs, or if you have, say, hypoglycemia, you may be in a more vulnerable bodily state. Hypoglycemia is characterised by a lack of energy, by an inability to focus, and so on. And so that bodily state, being more vulnerable, will encourage you to make the kinds of appraisals that lead to fear and anxiety. Other drugs and other conditions might sort of put you in bodily states that maybe are more aggressive, which will encourage you to make the kinds of appraisals that lead to anger. So I think it's easy to see how drugs and certain medical conditions might affect the likelihood of making appraisals. The case of facial expressions are maybe a bit trickier, but again, the appraisal theorist might suggest that merely smiling can make you more likely to appraise the situation as a good one. This could just be because we associate smiling with positivity, so by smiling we prime ourselves to focus more on the positive elements of the situation, which will then lead us to make the kinds of appraisals that generate happiness. The effects of priming can be really quite striking. So for instance, in the study Automaticity of Social Behaviour by John Bargh, Mark Chen and Lara Burrows, participants were told that they would be tested for language proficiency, and they were given a list of words and told to construct a grammatical sentence from them as quickly as possible. One group were given neutral words, the other group were given words such as lonely, grey, wise, stubborn, forgetful, traditional, bingo and bitter. Words, you might notice, associated with the stereotype of elderly people. The group who were given the words associated with elderly people walked more slowly when leaving the experiment than did the group given the neutral words. So that's a pretty striking case of being kind of primed by a certain stereotype that you wouldn't even have realised it. And there are countless studies showing similar effects. So maybe it's not a stretch to say that merely smiling might have an effect on the kinds of appraisals that you make. Okay, well that that's that. So that we've seen the James-Lange theory. That was the cognitive theory, particularly appraisal theories, which I think among the more popular versions of cognitive theory. I hope you found that helpful, and I'll be back soon. Goodbye.